following program is classified G. It's suitable for all ages.
Tonight, we take a look at how the law can understand the situation within Sri Lanka and help the country to grow rather than being a barrier in the process of growth. Sri Lanka has faced numerous red tapes in its endeavors to procure foreign direct investments in the past. Fingers have been pointed to long processes and the presence of multiple institutions, which doesn't create a conducive atmosphere for investments to take place. How is the law dealing with these issues as of now? What more can be done during this tough time to attract investment? Has the Port City Act materialized? And what is holding progress back? Good evening and welcome to Law, Land and Liberty, where we are keeping with the promise of bringing in a contemporary legal topic and bringing it down for our viewers. Now, as we all know, the country is going through a difficult patch and we are trying to look at the entire thing through a solution-oriented viewpoint. And for that very regards, we are taking up the topic of investment law. Now, the country has had an issue in the past of being capable of selling themselves on paper. And we're going to take a bit of a breakdown and understand where these barriers exist, where we can improve, and where we are going from this standpoint onwards. And to do that, we have with us someone who's not new to the show, someone who's been a very important resource person to our program, Dr. Asanga Gunawansa. Thank you so much, Doctor, for joining us again.
Thank you, and a very good evening to you.
All right. Dr. Asanga Gunawansa is the lead legal counsel at the Colombo Law Alliance and has been an arbitrator, a very important figure in commercial arbitration within our country, and we'll get a breakdown of all of that. But before we go into the topic, what we usually do is we give our viewers of the entire pathway we are going to take so that everyone is clear about what we are going to talk about today. Firstly, we are going to talk a bit about the laws within Sri Lanka promoting investment and what those are. We're going to talk a bit about the BOI and the relevant institutions that are there associated with it. Secondly, we are going to talk a bit about the role of the Port City Act and what exactly the evolution of that act has been. Thirdly, about multilateral contracts and conflict resolution. And finally, we are going to talk a bit about government policy.
Hi, my name is Dasun Das and I'm a medical student. My question is on the laws promoting investment. How can the current investment laws support or promote foreign direct investment in the short, medium and long term?
All right, let's go straight into the topic. Thank you once again, Doctor, for joining us. A pretty pertinent topic. I want to let you take the beginning of the topic and really give us a breakdown from where you believe it's important. But within this segment, when you say investment, what we hear is the Board of Investment. Mm-hmm. And then the steps taken from that point onwards to how a company gets registered or how the specific integral technicalities that go into place is not too clear. And I have also been visiting the BOI website for maybe the past few months, and it's a bit difficult for me still to explain to either a foreigner or someone about how that investment process takes place. And I don't want to put all of that onto you, but to talk about the legal aspect of all of this, Doctor. So where do you begin? I'll just leave it to you to say, how are we promoting investment from the aspect of the law in our country?
So I mean, to start with, let's look at the Board of Investment, this way. It was initially established, back in the late 1970s in order to facilitate export processing zones in Sri Lanka. And they did a fabulous job, I would say. It was quite successful, and we have our 2 or 3 free trade zones which are operating beautifully. And then there were various amendments introduced to the BOI Act. And then the role of the BOI is slightly changed. It tried to facilitate other types of foreign direct investment coming in. And for a while within the BOI, there was another entity called the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment, BII, which was promoting infrastructure investment in Sri Lanka with the participation of the private sector. They did a fabulous job. And even during the height of war, I would say that the BOI was very active in bringing in investment. But having said that, if you look at the current context, Sri Lanka is probably going through the worst crisis that we have faced since independence. So in that context, when you consider whether it would be now possible for us to reap the benefits of our laws and policies, as we did before, and whether there would be any adverse impacts on the forward march of the government towards, taking Sri Lanka from a developing state to a developed state. There are a lot of questions that, that come to my mind. Now, in order to explain this to the spectators, or the listeners and the followers, let's look at it this way. In the global system, there are approximately about 200 countries in the UN system. Yeah. Out of these, about 150 are considered developing countries. Now, if you look at the Asian region, of these 150, about 40 countries are in the Asian region. If you want to be even more focused and look at South Asia, about 8 of these countries are in the South Asian region. It's a huge market.
Yeah, almost the entire South Asian region.
Exactly, almost the entire South Asian region, and which amounts to about approximately 1/4 of the world population. So, if an investor is brave enough to take his or her, or its investment into a developing country, overlooking developed nations where, investment perhaps could be more easily facilitated and ease of doing business and all that is much better, then there is a wide choice. Even in Asia, there are 40 countries. Yeah. So out of these 40 countries, when you want to select or even consider Sri Lanka, any prudent investor would look at variety of factors to see whether Sri Lanka would be a hot investment destination for the investor to come in. So then what are these questions that they are looking at? Now, typically, an investor would look at the regulatory environment, the laws and policies in the country, and do they facilitate investment, do they provide for investment protection, and so on. Then the investor would look at whether there is a steady system of governance, steady and transparent system of governance. Right. Then the investor would look at whether there's a corruption-free procurement process in this country to go. Then they would also want to see whether the investment that they made in the country can be recovered. Right. Right. And then their earnings and profits can be repatriated easily. Then they would look at what are the investment concessions that this destination is offering compared to the other destinations. Right? Then the political stability, availability of infrastructure. Now, say for example, if you want to put a multi-story, let's say a mixed development project, or even if you want to do an airport or seaport, the road infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, the telecommunication infrastructure, all those support infrastructures have to be in place. Now, when you take all this into consideration, currently the transport system in Sri Lanka is a mess. We have an energy crisis. We are in political turmoil, right? The government, yes, there is a government in place, but are they is the government the chosen government of the people at the election? So all these questions come in. And maybe next 2 years we are running into elections, but a lot of people are still protesting. And there are various doubts, even among the local citizens as to where the country is heading. So in this situation, if we are to attract investors, and having said that in Asia there are 40 developing countries, some of these markets are much bigger. Sri Lanka has 25 million population. If you take Bangladesh, it has about 180 to 190 million. And the Bangladesh economy is doing much better than the Sri Lankan economy now. And even countries like Nepal and so on, if you look at the GDP growth, Sri Lanka is perhaps the lowest in South Asia. True. So taking all this into consideration, irrespective of whatever measures that we take, at least in the near term, it will be very difficult to attract foreign direct investment. That we have to keep in mind. But having said that, I don't think the government or the policymakers should give up, but we should do what is necessary, which we can talk about later, in order to give the necessary confidence to the investors to choose Sri Lanka as an investment destination. It can be done, but may not be during a short period of time. We will have to perhaps put some mid-term and long-term policies in place.
Right. Doctor, let's just look at this more in a more forensic manner. I think some part that I want to pick up on was investor protection that you spoke of in the initial part of the opening remarks you were mentioning. What does that encompass? What is investor protection? What are we I don't know if this is a futile question to ask, but are we keeping INPA updated with the kind of protection mechanisms that are in place in other zones, particularly moving away from emerging markets, looking at either European or like the West in those regards? Is that available here, or are we far behind in terms of that?
No, I think as far as our laws are concerned with regard to investment protection, we are pretty much up to date, with the rest of the world. For example, even in terms of our constitution and other laws in place, there is protection for the investors. And now, even when it comes to procurement, at least on paper, we have a procurement guideline, which has the effect of law as a result of various interpretations given by the judiciary. So we have systems in place. The problem is with regard to implementation. Now, say, for example, one of the biggest fears of an investor is that once the investor comes and does a major investment in a particular country, the project and the assets will not be expropriated or nationalized, by the government. Right. Now, if you look at countries like Iran and Cuba and some of the South American countries in the 1970s and early 1980s, there was a string of nationalization initiatives, and as a result of that, even international tribunals were set up to look into compensation. In Sri Lanka, that way does not have a bad reputation of a regime that goes and takes over assets of investors, and we rather promote investors. But we have other problems. Say, for example, when investors run into disputes with government, because some of these investment projects will take probably 20, 30 years, development will be 5 to 10 years, and then for their recovery process, recovery of investment will be another 20, 30 years, especially if you take a project like a BOT project. So during the life cycle of these long-term projects, there can be various disputes. So the investors would want to ensure that these disputes are resolved swiftly and they can get relief one way or the other. Now, if you look at the reputation of Sri Lanka when it comes to enforcement of contracts and so on, even according to the World Bank Index, we are, probably in the we were ranked on the 130th or 140th or thereabout, which is not a good thing. So there are those issues, when it comes to, for example, we don't have very efficient and effective dispute resolution mechanisms. And sometimes a lot of technical objections are raised without any merit. Yeah. And the entire dispute resolution process is prolonged as a result of it. And even with the investor, say, for example, goes through an arbitration process, wins an arbitration award, in order to enforce that arbitration award, again, another long period is taken because at the enforcement stage, it is challenged. Yeah. So these are things that we need to take into consideration. And perhaps the relevant policymakers should speak to the government instruments concerned to say that, whatever you do, perhaps you might be thinking that by delaying a payment or, challenging an award or challenging or raising jurisdictional objection in certain situations where there is no legitimate reason for doing that, you are helping the country, but you are not. Because the wrong signals are then communicated to the rest of the investors out there. And that is one of the reasons why we have been struggling to, reap the benefits of all the natural assets we have and promote Sri Lanka as a hot investment destination.
Right. I think a very important preamble there. Doctor, we'll take a very short break and we'll come back and we'll discuss about a long-term investment project, which is the port city, and what's really happening with that. You're watching Law, Line and Liberty. Stay with us.
Hi, my name is Shihara Ferdinando and I'm a second-year undergraduate at the Faculty of Arts, University of Colombo. My question is on the Port City Act. What is the role of the Port City Act and its contribution to making Sri Lanka more attractive for investments?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in conversation with Dr. Asanga Gunawansa. Doctor, very important preamble, sort of the introduction we gave to this segment on where we stand in terms of our investment strategy. The next big thing, or I think on this same show, we broke down this, the Act 2020 came about, and we are quite hopeful of the kind of pathway it could take. But as you mentioned, right now we are in different circumstances, to say the least. We have to really rethink our strategy there and rethink what we can do. Where are we exactly with the Port City Act? One thing I want to pick up on is, Doctor, if this goes away from the purview of what we have to discuss, it's fine. But when a foreign direct investment is to be made, they have to have some form of separate account that needs to be opened up with the central bank. I believe I'm not too clear about this either with the Department of Foreign Exchange under the central bank. So there are like those technical areas that we need to clarify. Are those things ironed out as of now, or are we still in the initial stages there? Give us your take on the Port City Act as of now.
Yeah, so let's talk about the Port City first, right? I mean, the Port City was initially perceived as a real estate development, and then subsequently the government wanted to develop it as an economic zone, which is a good thing, I think. And it is in that context that the Colombo Port City Economic Commission Act was introduced. Now, when you look at the Colombo Port City Economic Commission Act, it creates a Port City Commission, which is a regulator. And then it says that any investor who wants to invest in the port city has to be recognized as an authorized person, and therefore authorization will have to come from the Port City Commission. And then the most important thing there is it says that any investor who is going to invest in the port city will have to raise the investment concern or bring the investment concern from overseas. Okay. So you can't raise the investment locally through local banks or through local capital and so on, except in one exceptional circumstances where if somebody has already paid for Port City land in Sri Lankan rupees, then the value of that perhaps could be converted into part of the investment, in collaboration with another foreign investor. Now, when an investor brings in money to Sri Lanka, even under the existing system, you have to bring the money through an inward investment account, so that process is there. But the Port City Act refers to a different type of account through which these monies can come in, and for the purpose of enabling that, regulations will have to be passed. Now, I know that just perhaps a couple of weeks ago, one or two regulations have been passed, under the Port City Act, and one such regulation looks into this aspect. Now, Port City Act. Under the Port City Act, the Port City Economic Commission is supposed to not only play the role of the regulator, but also investment facilitator. Now, in order to get an investor to come in, get all the required approval and get an investment project up and running, there are certain things that will have to be done which is beyond the control of the Port City Economic Commission. For example, registration of a company, whether it's an offshore company or otherwise, will have to be done with the Registrar of Companies. Then if you need to get concessions, from the, say under the Revenue Act or tax concessions and so on, those will have to come from the central bank and the finance ministry. Then your environmental clearances from the environmental, agency or National Environmental Agency, or sorry, the Central Environmental Agency. Then if you need any concession with regard to customs and so on, that has to be, come from the Director General of Customs. So and then with regard to foreign exchange, it will have to be the Foreign Exchange Department of the Central Bank. So there are other entities that have to play a role in order to facilitate investment. So the Port City Act empowers the Commission to give approval to authorized person, and then also it empowers the Commission to make recommendations to other statutory entities in order to make sure that all other required permits, authorizations, clearances, and concessions come from those other relevant agencies. Now, I think you have to go one step beyond that, because there might have to be, this is how in certain other countries it has been done, you might have to have certain intergovernment or intergovernment agency contracts or intergovernment agency memorandums of understanding in place to say that when it comes to the port city, if an investor comes in and once the Commission makes a recommendation, within a very short period of time, all those other processing of this application will be done and the clearances will be given swiftly so that the investment can be up and running. Otherwise,
that's where the one-stop
exactly, because the unlike the BOI, the Port City Economic, and even it also affected the BOI under the BOI Act as well. although we like to call the BOI or now the Port City Economic Commission the one-stop system, it is not, because there are other laws and other statutory entities that play a key role. So that is where these intergovernment agency agreements we know will have to come into play. And I think going forward, probably the Commission will look into that aspect and it will have to be done. It has to be done in my view. And also, under the Act is more like I would say, a mother act which provides a framework for investment, but the actual implementation part of it is not specifically covered when it comes to certain areas. So as a result of that, there will have to be a series of regulations passed under the Port City Act as well as other legislation to facilitate investment. Also, one of the significant, if I may use the word lacunas I see in the Port City Act, is it doesn't define or specify what is the minimum investment that an investor should bring in. Now, as a result of that, there's a situation where, since the Act says that your entire investment has to be raised, from overseas, there might be an investor who wants to bring $5 million and do an investment project. There might be another investor who wants to bring 500 million and do the project. Now, the person who wants to do the 500 million project may not have 500 million with him. Right. He might have 50 million. So in that situation, he has more money than the first person who has 5 million. Right. But because he has only 50 million and he doesn't have the 450 million, we are losing out on an investment opportunity if we say no to that project. Right. So we have to be a little flexible. Now, say for example, we know how apartment complexes are developed.
Just to be clear, Doctor, does that mean they have to raise the entire value and show it before coming in?
If you give a narrow and strict interpretation to the provisions of the Act as it is now, that is my understanding. Now, the other example I can give you is, say, you want an investor to come and develop a real estate project, an apartment complex. And all over the world, very rarely are apartment complexes developed where the investor puts 100% capital. Investor puts about 10-20%, and then there are pre-sale agreements.
Yeah, they collect the other amount from...
Exactly. So you enter into pre-sale agreements and collect the money. Yeah. Now, even in Sri Lanka, if somebody wants to put 50 million and put a 500 million, state-of-the-art apartment complex here, he should have the freedom to enter into pre-sales agreement and collect the balance portion of the money required for the investment through the local purchases or foreign purchasers who would want to pay for it afterwards. Yeah. So those things will have to be facilitated. But having said that, the Act is a good start, right? And this is the first time, I think, in India there are a few free economic zones. But apart from that, this is the first time that in South Asia we are thinking of setting up economic zone that perhaps one day could be compared to what is happening in Dubai, Singapore, and other investment destinations. So even there, you have to take baby steps, in order to reach a particular level. And I suppose, we can do that too.
Yeah. Doctor, moving further into very specifically the Port City, the investment project there. What do you think is the most immediate next step that we need to take place? Because what if I go away from the entire legal discussion we're having, when as an individual, when you look at the Port City, you'd say we are not seeing material development happening. And if that is the issue, you're not part of the commission, but yeah. If that is the issue, is there a legal barrier that we are looking at that needs to be dealt with almost immediately? I know the Port City project is a very much long-term, the strategy is quite long-term, and we can't really expect immediate results. But is there some immediate issue that we are dealing with as of now?
So at the moment, I don't see there's a huge legal barrier to attract investors to Port City. As I said, the Port City Act is in place, and the Commission is, I know, in discussion with various consultants to see how regulations can be, developed to facilitate whatever that is, missing in the Act. And so we have a good enough framework to start investment. And I know certain investors have shown some interest. But the issue, the main reason as to why we can't attract investment now is nothing to do with the law. It's current state of the economy and the current state of the political situation in Sri Lanka. Right. And as I said during the introductory segment, when an investor selects an investment destination, there are a series of questions that the investor will look at and do a proper due diligence before selecting destination. So when we try to address all those questions, and if you are an investor, and if you want to tick saying that, okay, I have checked the first problem about, let's say, the regulatory environment, is it good? And let's say, yes, regulatory environment is good. What about political stability? Perhaps the answer would be no, right? What about the economic situation? Again, the answer would be no, right? So likewise, there are series of issues that will have to be considered. So unless we put those things right, whether inside the port city or outside the port city, we will struggle to attract investors.
In general. Doctor, I wanted to keep this for our last segment, but I think it would be more pertinent if you ask it now. When this again moves away from the legal discussion a bit, when looking at investors, and I know you have a massive experience in dealing with these foreign clients and how arbitration works in other countries, the questions they ask and the answers they receive, is it that sort of binary thing they're looking at? Is it yes, political stability is present, it's not present, or is it far more complex, far more forensic when it comes to how they look at a country? Because this question comes from the fact that, are we taking a look at the viewpoint of an investor seriously in those regards? Is it simple in terms of how they answer those questions, or is it far more complex?
No, I mean, it's far more complex, and also you must look at the investment partners who have come to Sri Lanka during the, say, last 10 years. If you look at any of the major investment projects in Sri Lanka, I think they have been either funded by a Chinese entity or to some extent some Indian entity. But beyond that, the traditional investors who used to come and invest in Sri Lanka, say from the Scandinavian countries, perhaps Japan, UK, US, we haven't seen them coming and getting engaged in large-scale investment projects in Sri Lanka for quite some time. Yeah. Now, the reason for that perhaps is when the investor looks at all those issues that has to be taken into consideration and decide whether these are good investment destinations to come, probably they end up with a negative answer as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. So we will have to fix that, right? Without trying to be political, I mean, say for example, what happens in the Sri Lankan parliament, right? Nowadays it's available in the media all over the place, so it's in public domain. Investors also can look at. For the last 10 or 15 years, what we have seen is, one political party criticizing the other political party. There are almost fist fights sometimes happening. Chaotic situation. And all this information is going out, right? But then what are we doing to fix it, right? Presidential commissions have been appointed, right? Other investigations have been committed. I'm not putting the blame on any particular regime. I'm telling that over the last 20 years, this has happened, right? But at the end of the day, if there were perpetrators, if there were wrongdoers, they have to be brought and punished, and that had not happened, right? And there are discussions about stolen assets. Then you must go after the assets, and if you don't have the resources, there are other initiatives that can be done. Now, for example, there is a entity which is functioning, within the UN system. It's a collaboration between the UN and the World Bank called STAR, State or Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative. Now, if you reach out to them, they will help you out with your investigation processes and so on. So for whatever reason, we have not reached out. And we are having bilateral discussions, multilateral discussions. During these processes also, if somebody believes that our assets, stolen assets are parked elsewhere, you can start investigation processes where the other regimes can also help, but it had not happened. The blame game is going on, but we have to go beyond that.
Yeah. Right? A very important segment there, Doctor. We'll take a very short break and we'll come back and discuss a bit about the conflict resolution aspect in all of this. You're watching Law, Line and Liberty. Stay with us.
Hi, my name is Ryan and I'm a law student. My question is on conflict resolution. What are the key mechanisms available for conflict resolution when it comes to bilateral and multilateral contracts?
Welcome back to Law, Land and Liberty. We are in conversation with Dr. Asanga Gunawansa. Dr. Two very important segments that we just passed, and this one, again, an area where we really took one entire program and we discussed with you about dispute resolution with primary interest focus on arbitration, which is, I think, still after that program, it is still a novel concept here. I think as a system, we haven't really changed our mindset towards, grooming ourselves towards that. Please do give us an update and correct me if I'm wrong there, Doctor. One other thing that I want to discuss in this specific area is the delays in dispute resolution. We need to deal with that. What are your experiences on the ground of how these delays really materialize? Do you see other countries doing far better? Is it far more efficient in other areas where we are really lagging behind for reasons unknown? What are your experiences on the ground, and then we can really talk about the conflict resolution aspect.
Yeah, so if you take a couple of comparator jurisdictions to see what's happening, let's say countries like Singapore, Malaysia, even Philippines, Thailand, when it comes to dispute resolution, whether it is through the court process or whether it is through a process of alternative dispute resolution like arbitration, things happen much quicker than in Sri Lanka. In Singapore, for example, the commercial courts are as efficient, and now they say even more efficient than arbitration. Okay. So as a result of that, parties are now deciding to go before the commercial court rather than going to arbitration. Now, having said that, since we are talking about investors, when an investor comes into a jurisdiction to invest, they would prefer to have arbitration as the dispute resolution mechanism, for the reason that they might feel little uncomfortable going before local courts, due to lack of knowledge or lack of trust with regard to how the court system functions. Now, if you do go to court, Sri Lanka, I already told you about the issue with the enforcement of contracts. We are looking at 4 to 5 years, even in the best case scenario, to enforce a contract through the typical litigation process. Okay. But arbitration can be quicker. But having said that, you have to consider international arbitration as well as arbitration seated in Sri Lanka, where we have domestic arbitrations. If it is international arbitration, probably within a period of 6 months to an year, even a very complex arbitration can be concluded. That is because even arbitration hearings, are held on consecutive days, and the hearing times are between, like, you can start at 10 in the morning and go on till 6 p.m. in the evening. The proceedings are ready by later on the day of the same day of hearing, and parties are ready, and so the entire process is controlled by very efficient regulation, and as a result of that, you can ensure that the process is quicker. When it comes to domestic arbitration, we have an issue, because preference among our arbitrators and also arbitration practitioners, lawyers, is to have hearings in the evenings between like 4 to 6 or whatever. The time gap between 2 hearing dates can be about 3 to 4 months. Okay. And then with various problems we are facing now with lockdowns and lack of transport, that's another issue. Even when certain parties or certain representatives of certain parties are keen to have online hearing, the other parties may be reluctant, or the arbitrators may be reluctant. So there are not everybody, but there are issues like that. And the result of this is the arbitrations that commence locally, they take a number of years to complete. Now, I have a few examples which I can give you. There's one particular arbitration where only one witness has given evidence, and that evidence has gone on for 3 years, because during a period of 3 years, only 6 sittings were held. There is another arbitration where a jurisdictional objection was raised, right, 3 years ago, and we are yet to proceed to the next level, right? And there's another arbitration where a jurisdictional objection was overruled, and for almost a year, a sitting could not have been held thereafter due to the parties, not agreeing on the date. So these are problems, and so when investors look at enforceability of contracts and dispute resolution, we are again sending the wrong signal, because we have not put processes in place to make sure that we can conclude these things very swiftly. Then even when it comes to international arbitration, as I said, in an international arbitration, award can be taken probably say in a year or so. But once that award is to be enforced, if the award is to be enforced in Sri Lanka, if that award is challenged, sometimes without merit, right, and the process, then you land a case before a competent court of law. From there is another appeal, to the Supreme Court. It can delay the entire process. So very recently we concluded arbitration before the Supreme Court, where from the time the award was given, when the enforcement application was made, it was challenged in the Commercial High Court, then went to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court eventually dismissed the challenge. But it took nearly 5 years during this, from the time of filing the enforcement application to the conclusion. So what message does that give to a potential investor or an investor who is already in, who might be interested in doing other projects?
Right. It's an important point. I believe you really gave us a lot more details again when we were discussing this on the commercial arbitration aspect. Doctor, if we try to take a step back, and now again there's a mindset issue in terms of how we have the systems that we have established for so long, people not wanting to change and everything. But if we take the Arbitration Act in particular, are there technical changes that you believe that we need to put in place as of now? Where do you think that should happen?
Absolutely. So our Arbitration Act was perhaps the first Arbitration Act following the ancestral model law, which was introduced in the South Asian region. Perhaps maybe even in Asia, but I know for sure in South Asian region.
So we have had time to improve.
Yeah, 1995.
Right.
Now, the ancestral model law itself has gone through a couple of amendments since then. Because as I said, you can introduce the act, and then over a period of time, when you implement provisions of the act, you see certain weaknesses, you have to address it. Unfortunately, since 1995, our act has not been amended. The arbitration statutes in India have been amended, in other countries like Singapore, England, wherever, all those statutes have been amended. So they have very modern systems catering to the modern and the current needs of parties. Now, the former Justice Minister perhaps recognized this need and appointed a Commercial Law Reform Committee, I think in consultation with the Bar Association, and I was also invited to be part of it. And we were asked to look at the Arbitration Act and see how to fix all these problems. So there is a very comprehensive amendment that has been developed now, and it has been submitted to the Ministry of Justice. And I'm not too sure about the current status of it, but eventually if it goes through Parliament and if that act is enacted, then we will have a state of the act on par with other comparator jurisdictions that we are looking at. So the things that had to be fixed was, say for example, interim relief. The issue of interim relief was not very clear, and in the Arbitration Act, because from the time dispute crystallizes to appoint arbitration tribunal, you have 2 to 3 months sometimes. So although you can seek interim relief from the arbitrator, that is after the arbitrators are appointed. So until then, you have to run to court. Now that is not specifically mentioned, but due to inherent powers that court has under the Judicate Act and all that, our courts have been progressive enough to address that lacuna and give interim relief in certain situations. Then there are issues about multi-party arbitration. For example, there can be a dispute between a developer and a contractor, and then there can be a back-to-back dispute, relating to that between the contract and a supplier or contract and a subcontractor. Now, in a typical litigation, you can bring all the parties together and resolve the dispute. But in arbitration, unless you provide for it, it can't be done, right? So in other statutes, like in places like Singapore, and then arbitration rules like the ICC rules and so on, there are provisions for facilitating multi-party arbitration. So we have also introduced those provisions into our Arbitration Act. Then sometimes there are provisions you find in other arbitration statutes for expedited hearings, in certain urgent situations. And our act was silent on that, so we have introduced those parts as well. So likewise, if this new act, which has been drafted, if it
comes to the channels and passed by Parliament, we will have a state-of-the-art act. I think that really comprehensively puts where we need to be heading. We'll take a very short break, Doctor, and we'll come back and talk a bit about government policy in our last segment. You're watching Law, Line and Liberty. Stay with us.
Hi, my name is Netmini Veerasekara and I'm an engineering technician. My question is on government policy. Are the current tax laws and other government policies conducive for growth of investments in Sri Lanka?
All right, welcome back to Law, Line and Liberty. You're joining us on our last segment and we are in conversation with Dr. Asanga Gunawansa. Dr. 3 very important segments that we just passed on current situation in terms of where we need to be heading. And our last segment, a bit about you did really touch on this in parts when it came to the other segments as well, about what the government policies should be in the event of attracting investments. Now, I think I interrupted you when you wanted to bring in comparisons between, or draw some parallels between how other countries overcame this sort of, block in terms of bringing in investments. And we see in one aspect, we were going for a production-centered economy, and then from another, in supporting that, we really need this sort of the catalysts coming in. And one of those catalysts were going to be, or is supposed to be, Port City. What sort of policy initiative do we really need right now? If you can analyze it in two ways, Doctor, I think it'll be important. One, considering all the factors that we have, the current situation in the country, and secondly, if we were to say general infrastructure is met, were there other countries that were capable of overcoming this issue and bringing in investments?
Yeah, so there are other countries who have faced similar situations like Sri Lanka. I can give you a few examples. But what we need to realize is that countries can recover from situations like this. But the recovery time is not as short as some people like to think or expect. So that's where the examples come in. Now, if you take Greece, for example, as we know, around 2009, Greece was in a severe economic crisis. Even with the fullest support of the European Union, they are looking at recovering and getting back to what Greece used to be by 2026. So that's a 16-year period during which they are trying to, plan their recovery. If you look at Lebanon, for example, used to be known as the Switzerland of the Middle East, right? And then we know due to bad debts,
because of investments coming in.
Mainly due to bad debts and bad planning that the Lebanese, economic crisis happened. Now, the government of France is, really behind Lebanon and pushing entities like IMF, to come forward and support Lebanon. And they are trying to put some policies in place to see whether the country could recover. But 10 years later, after the economic crisis happened, still, they are nowhere near what they used to be before the economic crisis, right? So again, the recovery period would be about 15 to 20 years. A better example is, I would say, Zimbabwe. Right. Between 1999 to until about 2007 or 2008, we all know that Zimbabwe had a major economic crisis, food crisis, and so on. And it's only now, probably after a decade or so, that Zimbabwe is showing signs of recovery. I think the latest GDP growth rate is about 5.1%, which is pretty good. And when you look at how have they recovered, so they have fixed their agricultural policies and make sure that farming and agriculture is given top priority. National production, right, has been looked at. Industrial development, industrial revolution has been looked at, alongside putting fiscal policies in place in consultation with entities like IMF, and that has helped them to recover. So in this context, what should Sri Lanka do? Well, I think Sri Lanka has to do several things. One is we have to speak to traditional as well as non-traditional investors and traditional as well as non-traditional donors.
Right.
So traditional donors have been, or traditional funding agencies which have helped Sri Lanka have been the ADB, the IMF, World Bank and so on. Under bilateral arrangements, we have got, assistance from the US, UK, Japan, China and so on. But we might have to look beyond that, right? Maybe go back to the Scandinavian countries, go back to the European Union, go to the powerful Middle Eastern countries, But then you will have to show them that you are putting proper fiscal policies in place for the country to develop and not just to borrow money and add on to the debts that to an already debt-ridden country. So how do you do that? If you look at the subsidies given in Sri Lanka, I think it's probably way more than most other developing countries. In fact, I would go on to say that elections in Sri Lanka are won on promise of subsidies.
True.
Right? So we can't go on subsidizing people instead of educating people, right? And asking the people to pay the right price for the right thing, because the moment you try to subsidize, and if the government and developing countries don't make profits at the end of the day, if you look at their balance sheet, right, there is always debt. So in that situation, in order to meet the subsidies, you keep adding on to the debt.
Yeah.
The recovery of taxes in any welfare government system, the people who benefit from the welfare government has to pay taxes, right? Now the question is, do Sri Lankans pay proper taxes?
Yeah.
The answer to that would be no, right? I don't think most people pay the right taxes, or there is a system to process the income of people properly and charge the right taxes. Then after election, sometime rather than looking into fixing the tax policy, we give tax incentives, right? Or tax concessions or tax cuts. So that has not helped. Then when you introduce policies like, say, for example, going green and trying to be climate friendly, and all these are good things. But when you introduce policies, say, for example, the fertilizer issue, I don't want to go into detail, in the long run, these could have helped the country. But when you introduce policies like that, you must also look at the other adverse repercussions, on a country's economy. So we need to, those are the things that we need to fix. And if we go to the IMF and try to borrow, whether we go to ADB and try to borrow, or whether we try to attract investors and not borrow, but recover through investment, we have to show that there is a system fix in place. Or we are taking the right decisions and right initiatives to correct what has been done, incorrectly in the past.
Right. It's always very educational to speak to you, Doctor, but time always comes against us, and there's a lot more to discuss with you, and we hope you join us, and more than anything, we hope that you stay here and support the country through this entire issue, because you're the kind of mind that we'll require. Thank you once again for joining us, Dr. Asanga Gunawansa, the lead legal counsel at the Colombo Law Alliance.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Doctor. All right. It is high time we take a look at how we as a nation can better strategize our inbound investment portfolio. Legendary investor and business tycoon, who was also Warren Buffett's partner in Berkshire Hathaway, Charlie Munger once said, "All intelligent investing is value investing, acquiring more than you are paying for." A concept that must be clearly understood if we are to look at long-term investment as a country. That is all from us here at Law, Land and Liberty. If you had missed today's program, you can watch the entire episode on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Derana English. Join us again next week as we break down a contemporary legal topic. I'm Danidithan Vasam. Have a great night.